week's Tuesday tip is taking a look at the role of pollinators, from their impact on us to how we can help protect the pollinators. Hi, I'm Sherri, and I'm here today with Sonya. We are University of Missouri Extension Master Gardeners of Greater Kansas City. Today, we are at the Blue Springs Historical Society. Here today is Dr. Tamra Reall, MU Extension Horticulture Field Specialist and Chapter Coordinator for the Master Gardeners of Greater Kansas City. Tamra has her PhD in entomology and is here to help us learn more about this booming field. Tamra, can you start with us by explaining what is pollination and what is a pollinator?
So pollination is where we take pollen from one plant to another plant. And this can happen in many different ways. It can happen through wind, or often it's through an animal pollinator. An animal pollinator could be a bat or a hummingbird. Often it's insects.
It sounds like any creature that visits a plant is a pollinator. Do you find that one pollinator is better than another?
Yes, there definitely are some insects that are better pollinators than others. Bees, for sure, they are built to be pollinators. They have hairs all over them that attract pollen to them. They also visit specific flowers. They will visit one type of flowers. Like if they find a patch of black-eyed Susans, they will continually visit those types of flowers, which is what the flowers want, because you're taking genetic material from one black-eyed Susan to another black-eyed Susan. So then those flowers are actually able to use that pollen in order to create the seeds.
What about butterflies? I thought that butterflies would be a major pollinator, and you also mentioned bats.
Butterflies actually can be pollinators, but I would consider them more of an accidental pollinator. They are going to visit flowers to collect nectar. However, they're not necessarily true to flower type. If they're on the same flower, they will visit different flowers on the same plant, but they're not necessarily bringing all of the pollen to many different plants of the same species, the same way a bee would. Bats also can be pollinators because any animal that's visiting a plant to collect nectar, they're going to get pollen on them. And then that pollen can be transferred to another plant if they get there. Do you like to eat?
I love to eat.
Me too. So pollinators are really important in that process of food being produced. When flowers are able to have that pollination happen, then we're able to have food produced by these plants. So if you've seen those pictures that talk about or they have a whole spread of food, perhaps in a grocery store or at a farmer's market, and there's so many different kinds of food that is out there. Well, 1/3 of every bite we take is actually thanks to a pollinator. So if we were to take away all the food that pollinators have been a part of, we would have a very bland bunch of food to eat. So food, because we like food, that can be a selfish way to look at it, because I'm looking at it from the human perspective. But when we look at it from a larger ecological perspective, the pollination helps plants produce seeds. So we're also talking about species continuation. If pollination doesn't happen, then we don't have the species of plants to continue to perpetuate. Additionally, many of these plants, they help our soil be stable. So if we look at a riverbank, let's say, the water can actually take the soil right away unless there are roots there that keep it stable. So a lot of our plants have deep roots that are able to keep the soil stable. So in addition to keeping our plants continuing, we have to have those in order to keep our soil stable so that we can grow even more plants, so that we can have more food to eat.
For over a decade, we've heard a lot about bees and the decline in the bee population. Do you find this to be true, or is this just really media hype?
So if we're talking about a decline in pollinators with bees or insects generally, this is not media hype. It's actually happening. There are documented studies of a decrease in our insect populations. And with that decrease in insect populations, we could have a real impact on our food and our economy. Insects are declining for 4 main reasons. That would be loss of habitat, pesticide use, as well as parasites and diseases, and then also climate change. So to give you a little more information about what loss of habitat would be like, It used to be that people lived out in the country and they had their own gardens, and we had many things growing in our gardens. And that was really helpful to our pollinators when they would come in, because they could get, well, just like you and I eat from the rainbow, insects also need to be able to get nutrients from multiple plants, because that helps supplement their entire diet. And now, where most of us live in the cities and we have these large monoculture farms, they're really only in bloom for about 2 weeks or so. So that means that bees are now having to fly farther for less nutrients, which really can have an impact on how healthy they are.
I don't live on a farm, so what can I do?
That's a great question. So most of us don't live on a farm, but many of us do have an area that we can grow some flowers. If you live in a house and you have a yard, you could have plant a garden. You want to have 6 to 8 hours of sunlight so that you can grow vegetables, or you can grow a wildflower garden. Even if you live in an apartment, many people have a balcony that they can put some plants on, or a windowsill garden. If you don't have options for either windowsill or balcony, perhaps you live in a city that has a community garden where you could rent a plot to grow some flowers or your vegetables.
Does a small garden really matter?
I would say it does. I would say that really any garden that we have is going to matter. It can matter what kind of plants you put in there. Some are definitely going to be better than others, but all of our flowers matter. So one thing that some people don't consider as a garden could be, honestly, your lawn. If you are able to just if you let it just go a little bit weedy, we think of it as weeds, but they're actually flowers, and they produce pollen and nectar, which can be helpful. I purposely put clover into my lawn. Now, some clovers are better. Our white clover works pretty well. Also, red clover, it gets a little bit longer, but it works well. Something else I do is I might not mow my entire lawn, and so I'll leave some areas to be a little bit more weedy, more wild than others. If you live in an area where you have an HOA that regulates this, you might not be able to get away with that in your front lawn, but you might be able to in your back lawn. So I think that everybody can do something, whether it's front lawn, back lawn, a little bit, everything is going to matter.
Speaking of pollinator decline, I think we all get that pesticides are bad. Are there some sorts of guidelines that we should think about as we use them?
When we are growing a garden, we do sometimes end up with pest insects that can take over our entire garden and ruin what it is that we're trying to grow. So it is important for us to look at what we have. We sometimes do need to take action. Now, when we take action, the first thing you do should not be to grab for a can of bug spray. There's something called integrated pest management, or IPM. And what that is several steps that you would take in order to know how to go about controlling or managing a pest. So the first step is really being able to identify the pest. And so if you are noticing that there's a problem, that the leaves are being eaten, or that a plant is wilted, you first need to find out what is causing the problem. Is it a disease? Is it an insect? And if it's an insect, we need to identify what the insect is. We might need to identify it to species, and that's where extension can really help. So you can collect the insect and bring it to your extension, and someone like me will hopefully be able to identify it so that we can tell you, yes, this is a problem, or maybe this was just an insect in the wrong place at the wrong time. So the next step that you're going to be looking at in IPM is, what is your threshold? So your threshold, there's a couple different levels. One is how much damage are you willing to tolerate? And is there a certain amount of damage that will actually create an economic threshold where you won't be able to get profit? So that's in a commercial horticulture industry where we have to worry about the commercial threshold. In a home garden, our threshold is what we're able to tolerate before we need to actually enable some sort of control. So in my personal garden, I love tomatoes. I grow a lot of tomatoes. I also know that there are certain insects that come and visit the tomatoes. For example, the tomato hornworm. It's also tobacco hornworm. They look very similar, but they will devour an entire plant. A lot of people find that to be a pest, and it can be a pest, but the next life stage of the hornworm is a sphinx moth, also called a hummingbird moth. They're really fascinating moths. I love them. And so I actually plant enough tomatoes for both of us. Tomatoes for me to eat, and I plant tomatoes for the hornworms to eat as well. So another plant that I really enjoy eating is our squash plants, or well, I enjoy eating the squash. However, my experience with growing squash out here is that we have a lot of squash bugs, and they're really difficult to control. So whereas I really, really appreciate a homegrown tomato, to me, zucchini tastes the same whether it comes from the store or when I grow it myself. So this year I decided I wasn't going to grow squash, and I wasn't, because I didn't want to add those chemicals to my yard in order to control the squash bug.
I'm not sure that I have the tolerance level for pests as I have such limited space. Is there something I can do for pest control?
Good question. So this all kind of comes back to site assessment. You need to make sure that you know what your landscape provides, so that you can put the right plant in the right place. When you have the right plant in the right place, then plants have defenses that they're able to use. So we're talking about making sure that they're getting enough sun for whatever it is that they require. Some plants prefer sun, full sun, and other plants prefer some shade. We need to make sure we've done a soil test to make sure that our plants are getting the proper nutrients, because again, if they are healthy, then they're able to use the defenses that they already have. That said, there are going to be times that there are problems, and we're going to have to deal with it. So the idea is to use the least toxic method first. That will do the job. And what that might be is actually taking a container of soapy water out there and hand picking the insects off. So sometimes we have to go a little bit more than just our hand picking, and that might mean that we have to put something on the plant. Now again, that is not getting the most toxic thing that you can just spray and kill everything, because that causes problems on its own too. But maybe it's a horticulture oil, or maybe it's a horticulture soap. There are people that will say that we don't want to use chemicals in our garden. Well, keep in mind that this is not just a synthetic versus an organic argument. Even if we put horticulture oil or horticulture soap, those are chemicals. But again, we're trying to use the least toxic methods in our garden, because especially when we're talking vegetable gardens, these are things that we're going to eat. Another thing to keep in mind when we have to put something in the garden is most of the chemicals that we use do not distinguish between good bugs or bad bugs. They just kill insects. And so when we need to put something out there, we want to make sure that we're not creating a bigger problem. If we go back to the hornworm example, again, I like the moth that comes from it, but there are other insects that like hornworms as well. And so we might end up having biological agents or parasitic wasps that will lay their eggs in this hornworm, and that will take care of that problem as well. There are additional things we can do. So if we're watching for when things are in bloom, try not to spray when we have blooms on the flowers, because our bees visit our flowers. We also could make sure that if you do need to apply pesticides, that you do it at a certain time of day. So bees are sometimes active about an hour before sunrise, and they also can be active until about 2 hours after sunset.
You mentioned parasites and disease. Is this the colony collapse that we hear of?
So colony collapse is really a whole bunch of things that has been there. Our bees are dealing with a lot of things. I mentioned earlier that there can be nutritional deficiencies, which can suppress their immune systems. There also are a lot of pests that they deal with. For example, there can be mites that can be on them. One of the mites that can be on them, it would be essentially like having a dinner plate insect on your body, sucking out body fluids. That takes a huge toll on our bees. There are also tracheal mites. There are other insects that can be in a hive. Now, these are just for our honeybees that I'm talking about right now. Our native bees also deal with a lot of different problems. We don't actually know a lot of the problems that they're dealing with because there just hasn't been a lot of research done on them.
And climate change?
So as our temperatures get warmer earlier and probably last longer, that is affecting how our insects are able to continue. So for example, if flowers are blooming earlier, but perhaps our bees are not emerging at the same time, that actually can create a disconnect for when certain bees would be feeding on certain flowers, and then how those flowers are actually able to produce the seed that they need to.
What are some things that we can all do to make a difference?
I was hoping you'd ask that, because there are things that all of us can do. First of all, we can create more habitat. You can plant more flowers. You can make sure that you're using IPM so that we don't have to put a lot of pesticides out there. Something to consider when we're looking at flowers to plant in our yard. We want things that are adapted to our climate, to our specific location. This all goes back to that site assessment that I talked about earlier. One thing that we might want to consider are native plants. This isn't like you just go and pick up a native plant and plop it in the ground. You need to get the right native plant. Again, right plant, right place. Native plants have specific needs as well. So I do have to say one more time, get that soil test and make sure you're putting things in the right place. Native plants have the advantage of being adapted to our local climate and the different conditions that we have here. They also tend to not have all the extra petals, and they can produce perhaps more nectar. Some plants may have had some of the nectar bred out of them or some of the seed producing qualities, but our native plants have those. Going back to other little things that we can do, again, like leaving some of those flowering plants in our lawns, leaving some clover, leaving some of the other things that are in there, maybe leaving a little bit of it a little bit wild, and maybe not mowing all of it every single time so that some of the flowers are always there. All of those things do tend to help. Again, using IPM principles if you do need to actually apply something if there's a problem, because there will be problems, but there are ways that we can manage it that are ecologically responsible.
With winter right around the corner, what can we do to help our pollinators survive our colder temperatures?
Great question. It is fall, and so with cooler temperatures, we're wanting to get out there, and a natural tendency for us gardeners is to clean up our garden. Well, I'm going to recommend that you don't clean it up too much. In a vegetable garden, we do need to clean things up so we don't end up perpetuating diseases and pests, but in a flower garden, we can actually leave some things. A lot of our native bees will actually use the hollow, pithy stems of many of our perennials to create or to provision their nests for their young. So if we can leave those, that's a great way to do it. If you do need to cut them back a little bit, let's say some of them are in the front yard, and again, we have an HOA regulation that we have to have smaller plants. Maybe you could cut them down to about a foot and leave the others, and then take those stems and put them in an area where the insects will still be able to live out their life cycle. Another thing, a lot of us end up with a lot of leaves that come from the trees in our yard. And if you have areas where you can put your leaves, leave the leaves, it's a great thing to do. It provides additional habitat for insects, a lot of our beneficials. If you have leaves that are, some that are in the lawn, if you have to mow over them, I totally get that. I'm not saying you can't do that. But if you have areas where you can leave the leaves, that's going to be helpful to them, to our insects as well.
If I wanted to get involved, are there programs I can join?
I was hoping you'd ask that question too. Yes, there are. So with University of Missouri Extension, we have many different programs. Some of the programs that I think are applicable to this subject would include the Extension Master Gardeners, of which you guys are. That's a program where people learn about how to grow plants, but we also talk about insects and how to be ecologically responsible. Another great program is the Missouri Master Naturalist program. In that program, it's more generally wildlife and ways to be a good steward for our environment. Another program is the Master Pollinator Steward program. It's relatively new, but it talks about all of these different parts. We first talk about insects generally. We get to know our insects, and then we talk about plant pollinator stewardship. We talk about our honeybees, we talk about our native bees, and then we talk about all of this coming together. So insects in relation to agronomy and also in our urban environments. There are lots of ways that we can learn more and be better environmental stewards.
We really appreciate your time today. You've given me some really great things that I think I need to take home, and this winter and this fall I can now make plans and make changes.
I didn't realize that when you use dust as a pesticide, that it can be harmful to our pollinators, especially the bees who can get it all over their little furry little bodies and they take it everywhere. It just amazed me, and I will never use dust again.
We hope you enjoyed today's Tuesday tip. If you like our videos, be sure to give us a thumbs up. Be sure to check out the MU Extension guide sheets and our resources in the Show More section below. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on our next video.
See you in the garden.
Volunteers from Master Gardeners of Greater Kansas City provide free, research-based answers to your yard, garden, and plant questions. Voicemail is active 24 hours for your convenience, or you can email your questions to the hotline. Normally, you will receive a response within 2 business days. So for any of your garden questions, call the hotline at 816-833-TREE. That's 816-833-8733, or send your email to mggkc.hotline@gmail.com. More complete information can be found on our website at mggkc.org. And don't worry, all of this information is in the Show More section below.